So, as the Catholic Church is gaining all of this power, there's a newer religion that is also gaining power during the Middle Ages, and that is Islam. So, around the year 610, Islam is born when a man by the name of Muhammad is visited by an angel in a cave, and the angel tells him the word of Allah, the word of God, and he writes it down. And once he writes it down, it is made into a book called the Quran. And so this religion starts to really take off. And it's because of its rise to power that it starts to create conflicts with the Catholic Church also gaining lots of power. And so they do it in very similar ways, where the Catholic Church has Messiah Jesus, the Islamic religion has the Messiah Muhammad, one has the Bible, which is taught in their churches, and then the other has the Quran. And so they both start to spread across Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. And as a result, there are places where they sort of meet, and when they meet, it becomes a conflict, right? A fight over which religion should take this kingdom or this country. And that is worsened by the fact that they both demand sort of absolute faith in their gods. And so all of this sort of comes to its peak when they both start fighting for the Holy Land, Jerusalem, which for both religions is the exact same place. And so because of that, the Catholic Church doesn't necessarily have its own army in order to do this conflict. So what it does is it calls upon the people who follow the church to send their soldiers, the rulers, the leaders to do that. So France and England send soldiers in order to fight in this war, among others, of course. And then the Islamic Empire does the same thing. And it becomes a very bloody war that lasts for a very, very long time, because it kind of becomes this game of tag where the Catholic Church will take the city, and then the Islamic countries will take the city, and then the Christians take it again, and then the Muslims take it again. And because of that, we don't just have one crusade, sort of one war, we have 9, lasting from the year 1095 all the way to 1291. So a couple hundred of years worth of fighting. And so the conflicts that are created from these are sort of because of some of the similarities between the two. Like I mentioned, they both have messiahs, they both have these holy books that tell them what is right and what is wrong. They're both sort of gaining power through their teachings, as well as they both have the exact same Holy Land. So something to think about when you're answering the question about the rise of Islam. Okay, let's move on. So now let's talk about some of the cultures that were less defined by faith. So we mentioned about how faith and religion had created a lot of conflicts in the West. But when we start moving to the East, we don't see as big of an issue with religion. And what I mean by that is that when answering this question about which ones are influenced by it, specifically I want us to look at, so the Catholic Church had actively sort of pushed down or suppressed a lot of scientific discovery because it went against what the church believed. One of the biggest ones you might already know of is whether or not the earth is the center of the galaxy, right? Does the sun revolve around the earth, or does the earth revolve around the sun? Well, many scientists during the medieval, astronomers during this time knew that when they were sort of calculating things, that of course there were things wrong with saying that the sun revolved around the earth. Some things didn't line up whenever they would, put it on to a timeline. But you couldn't say that specifically because what the church was preaching at this time is that the earth is the center because God made the earth and it is the most important thing. Everything else sort of is supposed to move around it. And you can't go against the church. You can't say that. So many scientists sort of had to keep quiet about it. We have a very another term for this time period in Europe is called the Dark Ages. Not just because there was the plague, but also because of sort of the suppression of knowledge, the pushing down of new discoveries. So we see other cultures, like I have the ones listed here, China, Japan, and India, which were less influenced by their religions. Now, that's not to say that they didn't have religions. You can see here that I have highlighted China had Confucianism and Taoism. Japan had Shintoism and Buddhism made its way. Taoism also makes its way into Japan later. And then, of course, India has Hinduism and Buddhism, but they were not fighting they were not fighting wars over how much they believed in these religions, and they kind of more brought new ideas and ways of thinking to each of these places. So this question about comparing things like Spain or France with their sort of advancements at this time with these more Eastern countries is to make us think about in what ways did religion kind of hold us back, or is that not a part of it at all? Because, for example, China during this time does have its golden age. And so you might be able to argue that because of that, religion held back the Europeans from really doing well because they were too busy fighting amongst themselves and letting the church instead of science kind of be promoted. But then there's also places like Japan, which Japan had its own fair share of fighting. If you check in your book, you'll see about the power struggles and civil war that happened at this time. But also similarly to China, India and a lot of the sort of Eastern countries around India are completely isolated from all of these events and have, some conflicts, but also some growth, but not as big as what maybe China would seem. So when you think about this question, I want you to pick one specific country and really try to focus on whether or not you think that that country saw more growth than what was seen in another country in Europe, like I mentioned with Spain or England or France. And let's talk a little bit about the differences between cultures affected heavily by religion and some that are less affected. So, religious societies, they tend to see a lot of artistic growth. But with that artistic growth tends to also come religious conflict. And some examples of that are, of course, the Crusades, but it is because of the power of the church that leads us into the next age when we have the Renaissance in Europe. So there are some benefits to having a religious society. But secular societies, secular just meaning ones that are more worldly, not as concerned about religion, or if it has religion, it's not one that is like Christianity or Islam where it's absolute faith, tend to also have a rise in scientific exploration and mathematics and just education in general. But because of that, they also tend to, it says here, lack a moral compass. And by that, it just means that they're so concerned with progress, they're not as concerned with being good to one another, to have that moral guidance that is offered by church and religion. And so our ultimate goal really should be to balance the two. And something to even consider is that some cultures, for example, the Islamic empire during the medieval age, did see a lot of growth in their science and mathematic fields, including being one of the first to have, I believe the first physicist came from an Islamic country at this time. So something to kind of think about, was it something specific to the way that the Catholic Church was controlling things versus how the Islamic religion controlled their empire, that made a difference in how things grew? Because again, for the Catholics, the church was very, very adamant, very strongly against allowing any scientist to tell them that the church was wrong. One of the biggest things noted was the sun revolves around the earth, was something that was taught by the church because of how God made the earth, and it is sort of the most important thing. But when you would run the numbers, so to speak, when you would do the calculations, scientists kept finding that the numbers didn't quite add up properly. But no one could really say anything or do the research to kind of prove that maybe the earth isn't the center of the universe, because that would go actively against the teachings of the church. And that could get you punished. So comparing that with Islam would also be an interesting way to sort of answer this question. You could compare a more secular country like China's golden age with the Islamic growth in science and mathematics. So it's up to you on how you want to answer this. But yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up. So to sum it all up, religion in the medieval world influenced things like politics and government. It influenced society and culture in a way that we still feel today. There are still very religious countries that always use the religion or Christianity, depending on where it is, as a guidance for what their country should or shouldn't do. And so understanding the rise of power in the church helps us to kind of understand how there is still an influence of the church itself today. And I want to leave you with this quote by Pope John Paul II on how vastly important religion is, and that is, to fall in love with God is the greatest romance. To seek him is the greatest adventure, and to find him the greatest human achievement. So I'll leave you to think on that. And everyone, that is all the time we have. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.